Eva had no idea, as a 13-year-old, how her game of hide and seek would turn out. She was told about a really good hiding spot. If you go here, no one will find you, by a friend that she trusted. And then that friend told the people who were looking for her where she was, and they found her. And at that point, the game was up. When she was telling me this story on Thursday night, she said after that all ended, she hated people. Not just the people who told where her hiding spot was, but everyone. She just hated people. The game had turned out badly, really badly. In fact, it had turned out to be a matter of life and death. Eva's story is the story of Eva Schloss, who was a young woman born in Vienna to a Jewish family in 1929. She became the stepsister of Anne Frank. She and Anne Frank played together as children in Vienna, and after World War II, Anne's father, Otto, married her mother. But she was born in Vienna in 1929, May 11, and then as Hitler's regime started to grow and to move west, her family moved to Amsterdam, as many Jewish families did. On July 6, 1942, when Eva was 13 years old, she and her mother went into hiding. They had to split up. Her father and her brother went to one place, and she and her mother went to another place. And so they had to hide. And you've seen movies like The Hiding Place or The Diary of Anne Frank, and they spent time hiding and trying to stay away from the Nazis. And when Eva was 15 years old, a Dutch nurse said, I have a great hiding place for you. If you and your mom will come and hide here, no one will find you. And then on May 11th, Eva's 15th birthday, they were having breakfast, and there was a knock at the door, and it was the SS. And they captured her and her mother. Then they found out where her father and her brother were hiding, and they captured them. And that was it. Her family was moved to Auschwitz and Birkenau concentration camps, where they spent the remainder of the war until January 17th, 1945, when they were liberated by the Russian army. But they later found out that it was the Dutch nurse who had given him a hiding place who told the SS where she was. I've been reading Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, and Viktor Frankl was also in the concentration camps, and he survived it. He was a psychiatrist who did most of his practice in Vienna, but ended up in Auschwitz in 1944 with his mother and his wife, and they both were killed there in the concentration camps. And I'm interested in this topic because it seems important not to forget what can happen in the world. And so when I heard that Eva Schloss was going to be in Spokane on Thursday night, I thought, I got to go. I got to go and listen to her story. And so there was a Q&A time after Eva shared her story, and people were able to ask questions. And she was asked this question: were you able to forgive the Germans after the war? And she said, no. I hated everyone, not just the Germans. I hated everyone. I didn't trust anyone. Life was a wreck. I couldn't get past it. Again, her mother and her Otto Frank were close friends, and they both lost their spouses and family members in the camps. And after the war, they got together. And there was a moment when Otto said to Eva, to hate others and to not forgive others is to think you're making them miserable. But in truth, it's only you who are miserable when you hate. And she said she realized at that moment that the hatred had been eating her alive. And she began to forgive and began to learn how to walk out this journey that she'd been on. And life started to change for her. I'm drawn to these stories of the Holocaust and the darkness because it's unimaginable to me how people survive these things and how they come out of them and they're happy. She's now 90 years old, a little lady who came out onto the platform at the Spokane Art Center with her purse. Why with your purse? But she'd come out, sit down with her. There she was. Her story was fascinating. She's sharp and clear. But we hear stories of resilience by people like Eva or Corrie ten Boom or Elie Wiesel or Viktor Frankl, who walked through those incredibly dark times and then out of them and into a life that was productive and good. But how? How? How do we walk through the challenges in life and not become bitter? How do we walk through those broken times in our lives and not just have it causes us to just hate everyone around us, or not ever to trust people, to not really let people in and into our lives? And it's a key question, and it's really hard to think about that. But one of the things that we have to look at is what are our expectations about the world? What are our expectations about life? And sometimes what needs to change is our expectations. And Viktor Frankl talks a little bit about that in his book. A few years ago in one of our staff meetings, we were talking about this and how sometimes people let us down. And this has probably been 4 or 5 years ago. And I said in our staff meeting, I said, people rarely let me down. And one of the people on staff, who's no longer on our staff, said to me, what do you mean people rarely let you down? I said, it's because I expect everyone to let me down. I genuinely expect every person in my life at some point to let me down. And this person said, that's an awful perspective as a pastor. How do you live with that? And I said, I don't mean that in a bad way. I don't mean people are bad. I just mean my expectation about people in my life is that everyone will let us down at some point. Everyone. And if we live our lives expecting people won't let us down, well, if you've been living your life that way, I'd love to hear how that's going for you. We're not bad people, but we are imperfect, and we stumble and we struggle. And so if our expectation is as we go through life, no one's going to let us down. Those closest to us aren't going to hurt us. We're going to be really disappointed, and it's going to be difficult to move along. And so we have to sometimes change our expectations. As we look at growing into emotionally healthy adults, we have to recognize that sometimes what's going on in us is there's a lot of pain and hurt and maybe even hatred, because frankly we have not been able to change how we expect people to behave. And when people let us down, it just builds this big stack and this big mountain of bitterness that we sometimes can't get through. And so we have to change how we process the world a little bit. As we look at this story, we're going to look at the story of the Good Samaritan, which I know is a familiar story to most of us, but we find that in Luke chapter 10. I'm going to read the text for us here. And behold, a lawyer stood up and put him to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? He said to him, What is written in the law? How do you read it? And he answered, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live. But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor? Jesus replied, A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side of the road. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, that's not an unimportant phrase, but a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave it to the innkeeper, saying, Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back. Which of these 3, Jesus asked, do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? And he said, The one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said, You go and do likewise. When Jesus is asked, what's the greatest commandment? His answer, as you know, is kind of simple. Love God and love others. This is the greatest commandment. This is the greatest commandment. When the lawyer is asking, what's the greatest commandment? That's it. Love God and love others. And as we think about growing into emotionally mature adults, we have to understand that growing into emotionally mature adults and spiritually mature adults means looking past ourselves. The world isn't about just us. We don't live that way. Peter Scazzaro says in his book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, that to grow spiritually, a Copernican revolution must take place in the way we perceive ourselves in relation to others. When Copernicus removed human beings from the center of the universe and said we revolve around the sun, not vice versa, it sent a shockwave through Western civilization to discover the otherness of a spouse, friend, boss, child, and co-worker, and to see them as separate, unique human beings without losing yourself is also a Copernican revolution of emotional maturity. And Jesus tells us this amazing story of the Good Samaritan, which on the surface seems like a pretty simple story, right? I mean, there was a guy who got beat up and he was left for dead. Somebody robbed him. And then 3 people came along. The first person that came along didn't stop. The second person that came along didn't stop. And the third person that came along, well, they stopped. And so if we read it that way, we go, well, those first 2 guys weren't really very nice, but the third guy, he was really cool. The reality is, if we're familiar with this story, and again, most of us are, we recognize that Jesus is telling the story in such a peculiar way that he really pushes hard against those people who are asking the question. Jesus asks, who's my neighbor? Well, it's the guy who had mercy on the person who'd been beaten up. But it's the people that Jesus uses. It goes beyond that. Jesus doesn't just say, well, there were a couple of random Jewish guys that came along the road. He's talking about the Jewish guys who should have known better. The first one was a priest. The second one was a Levite. They should have known. These were teachers of the law, like the lawyer was. They should have known the answer to the question. First it's the priest, then it's the Levite. They knew what to do. And so when Jesus is asked by the lawyer, what's the greatest commandment? And he says, well, what do you think? And he says, love God and love others. Jesus said, that's right. Now, but then the lawyer wants to know, well, who's my neighbor? Let's get down right to it. Who's my actual neighbor? So Jesus tells the story. The people who should have known the answer to the question, who's my neighbor, didn't. And so Jesus puts into really stark terms, it's the Samaritan. It's the people you hate. Who was the neighbor? It's the person you think would never do any good thing. The neighbor was the person who shouldn't have known the answer as well as the people who walked by. The Samaritans were really hated by the Jewish people. They were sort of persecuted by them. There wasn't a lot of love lost between these two people. And so when Jesus says, then the Samaritan, you can imagine just the hair on the back of their necks standing up a little bit. The Samaritan came, and he was the one who proved to be a neighbor. I feel like there are times when Jesus just kind of puts the knife in and just twists it a little bit. It couldn't just be a random Jewish guy who comes by. No, it's the Samaritan. It's the person you'd never expect. And he proves to be the neighbor. He proves to love God and to love others most because he steps outside of himself and goes beyond to check on this hurt man. And he didn't just check on him. He spent a fair amount of time with him, right? He put healing ointments and oil and wine on his wounds. He bound up his wounds. He put the man on his animal. It's such a specific story. He took him to an inn where he could rest and recover, and he paid the bill for the man to stay. And then he goes even beyond that, and he says to the innkeeper, hey, I'm going to be back in a couple days. Anything else you spend on this guy, I will pay. It's an amazing story. It's beyond any call of duty that would have been expected. And then Jesus says, this is the sort of thing that you'll do when you learn to love. You'll see the other as more important than yourself. And now this isn't a radically different teaching for Jesus, but it's a radically different teaching, right? When Jesus comes along and begins to teach this way, people are amazed by its teaching. First, that it has authority, but also that he says really bizarre things. You think about the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5. If someone hits you on the cheek, rather than striking back at them, turn the other cheek. If someone asks you to carry their pack 1 mile, carry it 2. If someone takes your tunic, give him your cloak as well. Love your enemies, Jesus said, and pray for the people who persecute you. This is what it looks like to love God and to love man. And while we have to fully understand ourselves, or at least as we try to gain better understanding about ourselves, in order to love other people and to love God well. Jesus says it's going to be tough to really love well if we put ourselves first. Peter Kraft has a little book here, Before I Go. It's one of my favorite books that he wrote. And it's letters to our kids that we want to tell them before we leave the earth. And this is one of my favorite letters in the book. It's number 6, The Most Important Person. He says this: one of the stupidest songs I have heard on TV was the theme song of a kids' show of the 70s, The Electric Company. It said, "The most important person in the whole world is you." Implied message: be a self-centered little spoiled brat. You're number one. Everyone else is number two. Here is an alternative philosophy. The most important person is God. This is as necessarily true as 2 + 2 = 4. It is true whether you know it or not, whether you like it or not, whether you believe it or not, so you'd better learn to know it and like it and believe it. Number 2, the second most important person in the world is the person you marry. Nobody else even comes close. That's what marriage is, and if you don't know that, you're not really married. Next comes your kids. Then comes yourself. Take care of yourself before taking care of anyone else except your kids, your spouse, and your God. Because if you don't inflate your own oxygen mask first, you won't be able to help others inflate theirs. 5, then comes your friends. Never betray a friend. 6, then comes everyone else you know, your neighbors. Then 7 comes the rest of the world. 8, then comes things. And any and all things, money, the things money can buy, houses, cars, and vacations. Stuff. Remember George Carlin's routine about stuff? Always people before things. Use things and love people, not vice versa. 9, finally, abstractions, ideas, causes, organizations, political parties, etc. They are means to the rest as ends. By the way, the church is not an organization, it is a family. I never saw organized religion, only disorganized religion, like Noah's Ark. I love this book, but I love his approach there. We have this idea that our culture tells us you are the most important person in the whole wide world. And the reality is it doesn't work that way. It can't work that way. If you see yourself as the most important person in the whole wide world, you will not be happy. We have to have this order right. It's God, and it's our spouse, and it's our kids, and then it's ourselves, and then it's all other people, and then it's stuff. And so who are the people who've hurt us? Who are the people that you struggle with? Maybe it's somebody who lives in your house. Maybe it's somebody who doesn't live in your house. But who are the people that you find most difficult to love? The people that maybe set you on edge, that you don't want to hear about, that when you hear about them succeeding or doing something good, you just kind of cringe a little bit. Sometimes we treat those people as objects. And if we treat people as objects who are in our lives to give us what we want and think we deserve, it will be difficult to love as Jesus calls us to love. We do need to work on loving. Who do you need to work on it about? Who are you struggling with? With whom do you need to restore relationship? And it's probable that the first step in the direction of finding healing is gaining understanding, and that has to start with listening. We're not that good at listening, but if we want to become emotionally and spiritually mature adults, we need to learn to listen well. It seems highly likely that in the case of the Good Samaritan, it was obvious where the man was hurt because he was naked. He had been beaten, he was naked. And so the Samaritan knows where he's hurt. But if you've been hurt in an accident, you find yourself in the emergency room, and you're laying there and the doc comes in, what's the first question you might hear? Where does it hurt? Because it's not always obvious. Sometimes it's not like you're bruised and bleeding. Sometimes you're not naked laying on the table. And the question is, where does it hurt? That's a really good question that we can ask others. When our son Noah was maybe 3 or 4, I can't remember exactly how old he was, we were at a church party and we were all having a great time and hanging out. And Noah came up to me and he said, you know, my arm really hurts and I feel like it's bent. Is it bent? And I looked at it and it seemed fine to me. It looked not that bent to me. It looked kind of normal. And I said to him, no, I think it's fine. No, I think you're fine. That's okay. And so he's like, okay. And he goes and plays for a little bit. And he comes back a little while later and he says, you know, it really hurts. It really hurts. And I feel like maybe it's bent a little bit. And at this point, maybe there was a little bump. And I was like, yeah, well, you know, it's a little bump or whatever. And then he goes away and plays. He comes back again. He says, you know, it really does hurt. And he's crying this time. And there was a nurse at the party. And I said, could you take a look at this? And she looked at it. She goes, I think that's broken. Took him to the walk-in or the emergency. I can't remember. And they did an X-ray, and they said, it's broken. Because I'm a good listener. In the category of because I'm a good listener, right? Like, just relax, dude. It's going to be fine. It's a little bump. No, his arm was broken. Sometimes we just need to listen to the people around us because it might just be broken. And it might not be that obvious. It wasn't obvious to me that his arm was broken. If it had been really sideways and bone coming out, I'd have been like, panicked because that's what I do when my kids get hurt. But it was broken. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is ask a question. What's hurt? Where does it hurt? What's gone wrong? And the Samaritan needs to know from the man who's injured what his needs are. What do you need? How can I help? His money's gone. He's got injuries. He's too far from home to go there quickly. And he needs rest, and there's an inn. This is the right decision. He's asked the man, what do you need? And he's taking care of that. Emotionally healthy adults are people who've learned that communication isn't only speaking, but it's learning to listen. It's not only speaking, but it's learning to listen. The problem with listening in many cases is that we just don't want to. Sometimes we're not good at it. Other times we just don't want to. We get hurt by people and we don't want to listen, particularly if it's a conflict. How many times does it happen that we're in conflict with others and we actually stop talking to them altogether? You're in conflict with a person and you go, okay, I'm going to find 5 people to talk to. None of them are the person I'm actually in conflict with. I would just like to suggest to us the possibility that that's not helpful. Now, maybe it is if the person you talk to looks you in the eye and says, I'm not your problem. You need to go find the person who is and talk to them. By the way, that's our role if somebody comes to us complaining. Not that we shouldn't listen. We should listen. But our job is not to take that in and take sides. Our job is to push back towards the place where broken relationship has happened. But often we don't want to listen to the person because we've been hurt. And anger rises up in us. And we go to this place, as my friend Cash Lowe says, we go to fight, flight, freeze, or people please. Like, we're in this conflict, and so we're going to fight, or we're going to run, or we're going to freeze. We don't know what to do, or people please. Just try to make the person who we're in conflict with happy. None of those work very well. And so we go back to the book of James, where James in chapter 1, verses 19 through 21 says, know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to speak, quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. I better do that again because I messed it up in the way that I usually do it. Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Therefore, put away filthiness and rampant wickedness and receive with meekness the implanted word which is able to save your souls. How do we turn when life gets sideways? Where do we go? John Gottman from the Gottman Relationship Institute in Seattle says this, that when your heart rate is above 100 beats per minute, you need to step away from the conflict because nothing good's going to happen after that. I love that. And I can feel it. Can you? I have a little bit of a high blood pressure issue. It's mostly under control, but I can feel it, can't you? When your beats per minute start to ramp up and you sort of feel everything in your body start to rise up. You know when it's not going to be a good thing. And sometimes you got to step away and really just try to listen so that we don't create more trouble. Learning to listen well is a part of being an emotionally healthy and mature adult. But what are the tools? Well, here's some tools for listening well. Don't go into conflicted relationships or situations ready to give someone a piece of your mind. Usually it's a piece you can ill afford to lose. Hang on to it. Like those relationships where you blow up. How many times have you in a relationship gone into like, I'm going to tell them what's going on. I'm going to go give them a piece of my mind. And they're really nice and it really just throws you off. This happened to me on Friday, by the way. I love Fridays here in a way because often they're quiet and I could just do my work. And Dana sent me a text and she goes, hey, the guy's coming to pick up the copy machine and he said he'll be there between 2:45 and 3. You know that just annoys me. Doesn't it you? It's like, hey, the repair guy's coming to your house. He'll be there between 2 and 4. Okay, I'll go there and waste my time waiting for him. I get it. I get it that they're on a schedule, but why do I have to be the one who hangs around so I can give them money? I don't know why. It just kind of rubbed me the wrong way. And I had planned to be at a workout at 2, and I knew I wouldn't be to the church by 3. So I texted Dana back and I said, no, I will be there, but just let him know I'll be there between 3 and 3:15. I wasn't changing my schedule. But I knew that it was going to take me a little more time. And so I'm not making this up, and I'm not proud of it. As I'm finishing my workout, I'm thinking, I'm going to show up and the dude's going to be grumpy because I was a little bit late. And I got there about 3:14. And I was like, I'm going to tell this guy, look, you can wait for me. You're providing the service. You wait for me. And so I pull in and he's still here. I was even telling myself I was pulling in, he's probably going to be driving away right now. I was going to be like, that's fine, come get it later. I don't care. It's your copy machine. Get it when you want. I got out of my truck and I walked over, and the guy gets out of his truck and he walks over and says, hey, how are you doing today? Man, it's great to see you. I understand you had something going on, and so you couldn't get here quite at 3, but it's great to see you, and maybe show me where the copy machine is. It's like, this is not working the way I planned. I was going to come here like I was lay into this guy, but not that I ever would do that. But I'm just telling you, I was just telling myself this story. Like, I don't even know why it hit me that way. I was having a wonderful day. It was great. Everything was grand. The birds were singing and the sun was shining. And I was just like, I was ready to just like, God, that's it. You wait for me, dude. I'm not waiting for you. And he was just the absolute nicest guy. At the end, I'm not making this up. At the end, he hands me this card. He says, could you sign here? And this just says that I was here on time and was reasonably professional. And in my mind, I was thinking, well, that makes one of us, right? But this is how it works, right? Don't go into conflicted relationships or situations ready to give someone a piece of your mind. Put your own agenda on hold. Begin by being still and quiet before God. And ask Him for the grace to listen. Really listen. To be quick to listen. Allow the other person to speak until a thought's been completed, right? How many times do we jump in before the thought's been completed? And force yourself to be present in what they are saying. These are things that are helpful. Ask clarifying questions. Is there more? When another person's done speaking, ask this question. Of everything you've shared, what's the most important thing you need me to remember? I really want to hear you. I really want to hear you. Several couples went from MLCC up last week into a marriage encounter in Leavenworth, and it was really the best marriage thing I've ever been to. And if you've ever been, you probably know what I'm talking about. But it literally consisted, for the most part, in you and your spouse writing thoughts and sharing those thoughts with each other. And so what you would do is you would write on a question, and then you would go back to your spouse, and we were charged to be silent with everybody else basically for the whole weekend. So you write, you go back to your spouse, you hand them your letter, they read it, and then you talk about that. It was brilliant. It was a great time. But it was mostly great because it gave us opportunity to listen to each other. Most people probably in that room, at least for me, I've been in marriage for quite a long time, and I've been through a bunch of marriage things. And so there was really very little that I heard that was like, wow, I never thought about that. But what was great was that we're just there to listen. And Charles and I are, we're doing fine, actually. But it was really good. We talked about things last weekend that we haven't talked about in a while. Not because we've been avoiding them, just because she's going her way and I'm going my way. And all of a sudden we're looking at each other and talking and listening to each other. And it was a brilliant weekend. Sometimes we just need to listen. There may be times when you simply need others to help you communicate, right? Sometimes you need somebody in there. But if you can commit yourself just to wait and just to listen and to learn to listen well, it can go so far in helping your relationships. And then finally, emotional and spiritual maturity is loving well. It's loving well. When Jesus is asked, what's the greatest commandment? It's simple. Love God and love others. And to love well means becoming peacemakers in some way. Jesus said in the Beatitudes that we should become peacemakers. To love well is to be a peacemaker. But we got to think about what peacemaking is not. So ignoring conflict or false peacemaking are not being peacemakers. And sometimes we do that, don't we? We work sideways maybe with somebody, but rather than actually go and have a good conversation and listen and just say, what did you hear? What are you hearing in the midst of this? Sometimes we just like to ignore conflict and hope it goes away, and that's not peacemaking. Just creating a space where at least we're not talking hard at each other is not peacemaking. We're not called to be pacifiers and appeasers who ensure that nobody gets upset. We're supposed to keep the peace. And so ignoring issues and problems, making sure things remain stable and serene is not the answer. Peace will never come through pretending that what's wrong is right. And so we need to hit those things head on. We need to learn to deal with those. Embracing conflict is the path to true peace, right? You can't have the true peace of Christ's kingdom with lies and pretense. They have to be exposed to light and replaced with truth. This is the mature and loving thing to do. And so if you want to be a peacemaker, your heart needs to be kind of engaged in the things of the Beatitudes, right? The poverty of spirit. I'm not always right about everything. It's not really about me. A meekness, a purity of heart, mercy, to have that at the center of our being. The problem with loving well is that it's a much more difficult thing to talk well about than it is to do well. The lawyer, the priest, and the Levite, they knew the right answers, but it was the Samaritan who actually got it right. They all knew the right answers, but it was the Samaritan who got it right. There's a story about the wise monk who was asked about love, and he says this, and I love this statement: love in practice is a harsh and dreadful thing compared to love in dreams. Think about that. Just let that soak in for just a second. Love in practice is a harsh and dreadful thing compared to love in dreams. One of the more important lines in the parable of the Good Samaritan was this: when he saw him, he had compassion. When he saw him, he had compassion. Compassion is just this: it's sympathetic pity and concern for the sufferings or the misfortunes of others. And so if we're going to love well, we need to find out what's going on in other people's lives. Here's something I really believe about the world. Most people who hurt you don't want to. They didn't set out to. Now, maybe there are people who do, but most people don't. And sometimes all we need to do is find out what's the backstory. What's going on under the waterline that's actually creating this angst in you. And so having compassion is having a heart to hear and love another in the midst of what they're going through. Often when others hurt us, it's out of some wound in their own life. And to be frank, we're not always that interested in working through the wounds of others because in some way we're not that interested in them. So to love well is to become interested, to get curious, to go to wonder when somebody is sharing or something goes bad. Trevor Hudson says this: never forget that everyone with whom you come into contact is sitting beside their pool of tears. And so sometimes there's pain in our lives that causes us to hurt others, and there's pain in other people's lives that cause them to hurt us. And the best thing we can do is learn to find what it is that's at the root of that and help them through. That means compassion. It means loving. Most people carry around wounds of some sort or another, relationship wounds, and it's important to get to the bottom of them. So when you see others who are hurt, when you see others who are in pain, what's the compassionate thing to do? Is to love. And what's needed most in the midst of this isn't to create more hurt, but to try to get to the bottom of where the hurt already is and to love well. Some of that is to be a person whose life creates a healing environment. Is being in your sphere of influence, is that a healing environment or a hurting environment? I've been working with these guys doing work with rescue missions over the last couple of months. It's been a lot of fun, but they've taught me a few things about a healing environment. I think they're really good at it. And there's some things that we know are a healing environment. A healing environment are these things. First of all, it's a place where grace flows freely. Does grace flow freely from your life? Is it flowing freely from your life? Do you have grace for others in the way that God has had grace for you? A healing environment is a place where forgiveness and redemption are experienced. Can you forgive? Can you be a part of redemption? It's a place where people feel safe physically and emotionally and spiritually. Are you a person with whom others feel safe? You've been in an environment where you don't feel safe physically, where somebody has maybe a temper problem, and when you're around them, frankly, you're just afraid it's going to go off. I have struggled with this in my life. I'm not even going to say right now that I'm not struggling with it that much right now, because I've struggled with this in my life, and it has to do with lots of things that go on with me. But are you the kind of person that others can be in the presence and you're not afraid? Because you know they're going to handle your emotional and your spiritual and your physical well-being carefully. Are you a person who's safe? Is the environment that's created around you a safe place to be? A healing environment is a place where authenticity is the norm. You know that you can trust because they've been trustful with you by sharing their real selves with you. Authenticity is important. It's a place where trust flourishes. It's a place where we're honest and open to admitting failure. A healing environment is where individuals are encouraged to choose personal responsibility. And it's a place of protective love and accountability. Is an everyday lifestyle. Are you a safe person? I want to ask you to really just let that sit for a second. And I want to say that because some of you in this room are not safe. And I'm saying I know there are times when I'm not safe too. If you want to help people to grow up into the people God's made them to be, you got to get safe. You got to create a healing environment around you, and that's an environment where grace flows freely and forgiveness and redemption are there, and people feel safe, and authenticity is the norm, and trust flourishes, and we can be honest and open about who we really are. You know, at MLCC, we're striving to be a place where any seeker can be engaged in authentic, life-giving community. Let me just say that again. We are working to create an environment here where any seeker, whether they've been here for 10 years, 30 years, or 30 minutes, where any seeker can be engaged in authentic, life-giving relationships, because that's what we're all looking for. And I've been reflecting on the question a lot lately, why are people of every situation so drawn to Christ, and yet people are a little terrified of the church? Think about that. I think that's a true statement. That in general, and I mean in general, the church, people love to be with Jesus. It didn't really matter what their cultural situation was. They loved to be with Jesus, and yet people are terrified to be at church because they probably haven't always found it a place that's filled with grace and truth. It's often one or the other. Neither in excess is good, but it's one or the other. And that's who Jesus was. We have this picture of Jesus in John chapter 1, verse 14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we've seen His glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. I love the way that Eugene Peterson paraphrases this. The Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. We saw the glory with our own eyes, the one-of-a-kind glory, like Father, like Son, generous inside and out, true from start to finish. Are we the sort of people whose lives spill over with grace and truth? Are we emotionally healthy? Sometimes we can't get there because, frankly, again, our expectations of others has caused us to be wounded, and we don't take the time to really listen and find out what's going on in their life, to really appreciate what it is that they're going through. In Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, he says something that I found completely fascinating. He talked about expectation. You know the people who died in the concentration camps? You know who they were? Sometimes they got sick from disease, but you know who they were most of the time? The people who thought they were going to get out at Christmas and didn't. The people who thought they were going to get out when the spring came and they didn't. The people who thought they were going to get out just before the winter, but they didn't. Those are the people who died. And he said it has everything to do with expectation and reality. This is what he says. What was really needed in the concentration camp, what was really needed was a fundamental change in our attitude towards life if we wanted to survive. We had to learn ourselves, and furthermore, we had to teach the despairing men that it did not really matter what we expected from life, but rather what life expected from us. We needed to stop asking about the meaning of life and instead to think of ourselves as those who were being questioned by life. This, I think, is profound. We needed to stop asking ourselves, what am I going to get from life? And start to ask ourselves the question, what am I being questioned about by life? Daily and hourly. And he goes on to say, life ultimately means taking the responsibility to find the right answer to its problems and to fulfill the tasks which it constantly sets for each individual. The way that people survived was to stop having expectations of life and to start asking, what does life expect of me in this place, in this moment in time? He goes on to say, even if life expects you to have a life of suffering, then what can you give to that? That's not easy to hear, but he lived it. And I think we could expand this to think about our relationships with other human persons. The question is not so much what we expect from others, but rather what's expected from us in relationship to others. Not are people giving me what I need, but am I the person I need to be in the midst of this relationship to help the people I'm with become who God wants them to be? And it's a hard enough task to even do that piece, because life breaks us and it hurts us. And the reality is we can't change other people. And so when we have that expectation that we're going to get other people sorted, it just creates more hurt. And so what's God calling you to in this journey? Who are the people that you need to touch? What are the things that are going on around you? Here's some questions. What person or group of people do you struggle most with and to have compassion for, and why? Who are the people that you need to work things through with? Have you worked to really hear their perspective or step into their story rather than making assumptions? Can you say that you've actually listened when you have conflict with others? Are there specific areas of unresolved conflict with others that you have failed to address and you need to? And what's keeping you from doing that? What are you afraid of? And how can you step into that? And take some time to reflect. Has there been a time when you have stepped in and you worked to make things right and had difficult conversations? And what was your experience with that, positive or negative? And why? And why? And is there a situation in your life currently that needs to be worked through? I want to invite you to think about where you're at with this. And then how can others help you along the way? Because we are given each other to walk through life with. To become an emotionally healthy and spiritually mature adult is to take our eyes off ourselves, to learn to listen well, and to learn to love well. To have lower expectations on what other people are giving to us and higher expectations on what we're called to give to them. That's our call.